Sometimes a story sounds so outrageous and bizarre, you wonder how it could possibly be true. A young singer, a famous last name, a quiet resort town, and a plan so reckless that it really could only have come from desperation. Before the night was over, one of the biggest names in entertainment would find himself in the middle of a crime that captured the attention of the entire country. It is a story of bad decisions and a ripple effect that lasted for decades. So pour yourself a drink, or we'll mix one up soon. Get comfy, and let's talk about a crime that could have only happened in the strange, glittering world of old Hollywood. Welcome to Capers and Cocktails, a true crime podcast that doesn't take itself too seriously and gives you something to enjoy while you listen. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you're enjoying one of our themed cocktails, ensure you're of legal drinking age and have fun, but drink responsibly. Frank Sinatra was born in Hoboken, New Jersey on December 12, 1915. He was the only child of Italian immigrants Dolly and Marty Sinatra. Dolly was a tough, politically active midwife who practically ran her neighborhood, and Marty was a former boxer turned firefighter and bar owner. Frank had a rough start to life, literally. He was injured during birth, leaving him with facial scars and a damaged eardrum, which some say was the reason for his unmistakable voice. Frank's rough upbringing also shaped his attitude later in life. People who worked with him often said he could be as charming as he was explosive, depending on the day and the drinks. But despite the odds, he climbed his way to stardom, becoming one of the most legendary entertainers of the 20th century, Old Blue Eyes himself. Frank Wayne Sinatra was born on January 10, 1944 in Jersey City, New Jersey, to Frank Sinatra and his first wife, Nancy Barbado. He was the middle child, with an older sister, Nancy, who became a pop icon, and a younger sister, Tina, who was a television producer later in life. The younger Sinatra was technically not a junior, as Frank Sr.'s middle name was Albert, but was nonetheless known as Frank Jr. for the rest of his life. When Frank Jr. was 6, his parents divorced, and he grew up in Los Angeles with his mother and sisters. Probably because of his father's fame, he didn't see him very much during his early years. Nevertheless, he was deeply influenced by his father's music, often attending recording sessions and performances. He would say that he always wanted to be a singer like his dad, and so he also immersed himself in music, studying piano and composition at USC. He also joined a singing group at Disneyland and eventually left college to become a vocalist with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra, following in his father's footsteps. At the time of Frank Jr.'s early performances, many critics described his style as more restrained and formal compared to his father's casual, swingy vibe. Frank Jr. had huge shoes to fill, and he knew it, but he was determined to earn respect on his own terms. And speaking of Frank Jr.'s famous father, let's drink. Frank Sr. was definitely known to enjoy drinking, and it became a well-known part of his public image. He was often associated with cocktail culture, especially the classic martini or a Jack Daniel's on the rocks, which he famously called the nectar of the gods. Frank Sr., along with pals like Humphrey Bogart, Sammy Davis Jr., and Dean Martin, were all fans of a cocktail called the Rusty Nail. Fun fact, the Rusty Nail was such a Rat Pack favorite that it was often ordered just by nodding at the bartender. No words necessary. The drink was simple but smooth. It has just some whiskey, a splash of Drambuie, I think, which is a Scottish liqueur made with honey and herbs, and a twist of lemon peel to finish it off. You can find that simple recipe in the description box, with a mocktail version if you're laying off the sauce. While you're in the description box, book a live happy hour for you and your coworkers or friends. I can do any case you'd like, and I have a repertoire of over 100 cases ready to go at a moment's notice. On December 8, 1963, just days after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, 19-year-old Frank Jr. was performing with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra at Harrah's Club Lounge in Lake Tahoe. It's important to remember the national mood when all of this happened. People were still reeling from President Kennedy's assassination. Frank Jr. had just finished a sound check and was back relaxing in his room 417, with a bandmate and eating some chicken before the evening show. Around 9 p.m., there was a knock at the door. 2 men were standing there, claiming they had a delivery. They had been expecting Frank Jr. to be alone, so the moment they stepped inside, they tied up Frank Jr.'s friend with tape at gunpoint, blindfolded Frank, and forced him out a side door and into a waiting car. Within minutes, the 19-year-old son of one of the most famous men in America had vanished. So who were these guys bold or maybe desperate enough to kidnap Frank Sinatra's son? Barry Keenan and Joe Amsler were both 23 years old and former grade school classmates of Nancy, Frank Jr.'s sister. Barry had once been a promising student at UCLA, but after a car accident earlier that year, Barry became addicted to Percodan, muscle relaxers, and tranquilizers. This addiction bankrupted him. He was broke and crashing out. Barry was obsessed with the idea that he was smarter than everyone else and he could pull this off, fix his life, and no one would ever know. It's the kind of dangerous confidence that only works in your head. In his mind, the solution was simple, if not totally unhinged. Kidnap someone famous, collect the ransom, invest it, and eventually pay it all back. He would say, for the rest of his life, that he had every intention to pay it back once he was back on his feet. Later, Barry would say, quote, "I decided upon Junior because Frank Sr. was tough, and I had friends whose parents were in show business, and I knew Frank always got his way. It wouldn't be morally wrong to put him through a few hours of grief worrying about his son." End quote. Okay, what? Joe, a Navy veteran from Kansas City and Barry's high school friend, was pulled into the scheme as his right-hand man. Joe reportedly had cold feet several times, but felt trapped by loyalty to Barry and the promise of fast money. The two of them had been tracking Frank Jr. for weeks, following him from city to city, just waiting for the right moment to strike. They had actually tried twice before, in Arizona and Los Angeles, before tailing him to Lake Tahoe for what they agreed would be their last shot. After grabbing Frank Jr. from his dressing room, Barry and Joe drove him 400 miles across state lines into Southern California, where they stashed him in a rented house in a San Fernando Valley suburb of Los Angeles. They treated him relatively well. They fed him and let him listen to the radio. They did keep him blindfolded. Meanwhile, panic was setting in back at Harrah's. Frank Jr.'s bandmate had quickly freed himself and called the police. In fact, the police had actually set up roadblocks and stops, and at one point, before the trio made it to the state line, the kidnappers had actually been stopped by police, but they had bluffed their way out of trouble. By 9:40 p.m., under an hour after the kidnapping, the FBI had launched a full-scale investigation. They quickly reached Frank Sr., who was in Reno at the time, and Frank Jr.'s mother, who was in Bel Air, California. Frank Sr. immediately flew to Lake Tahoe. The motive was presumed to be money, because, of course, it was money. The FBI recommended that Frank Sr. wait for a ransom demand, pay it, and then allow the Bureau to track the money and find the kidnappers. The following evening, Barry called a third conspirator, his mom's ex-boyfriend, John Irwin, who they set up to be the ransom contact. John called Frank Sr. directly and instructed him to await further instructions. The elder Sinatra, terrified for his son's life, agreed without hesitation. When Frank Sr. got the ransom call, he told the FBI that he didn't care what it cost. He would mortgage every house he owned if it meant getting his son back. John demanded all communication take place by payphone, and Frank Sr. became so anxious that he wouldn't have enough coins for the call that he kept 10 dimes in his pocket at all times. According to legend, he carried those dimes for the rest of his life and was even buried with 10 dimes in his pocket. On December 10th, the next evening, John called again, passing on the demand for a ransom of $240,000, which is roughly $2 million today. Frank Sr. gathered all of the cash in small bills as demanded and gave it to the FBI to photograph and make the drop. Following John's instructions, the money was delivered to a spot near Sepulveda Boulevard in Los Angeles between two school buses in the early morning hours of December 11th. While Barry and Joe nabbed the cash, John got nervous and decided to free Frank Jr. Frank Jr. was found near his mother's house in Bel Air after walking a few miles and flagging down a security guard. He later admitted that while he was captive, he spent a lot of time thinking not about escape, but whether anyone was actually coming for him. He described what he knew to FBI agents, but what he knew wasn't much. He had barely seen 2 of the kidnappers and only heard the voice of the third. Despite the lack of clues, the FBI were able to find the house where Frank Jr. had been held in Canoga Park and were also able to gather more evidence there. All of this was being well documented in the news. Yes, the press was that kind of press in this case. Are we shocked? And Barry, Joe, and John were watching closely. They were feeling the noose tighten around their necks. John, again, broke first, telling his brother what they'd done. John's brother immediately called the FBI office in San Diego, and within hours, all 3 of the men were apprehended, as well as nearly all of the ransom money. With Frank Jr. back home and the kidnappers behind bars, the case moved quickly, but certainly not quietly. The media kept media-ing and developed right into the circus that we know and hate. The trial began on February 10, 1964, just a few months after the kidnapping. Barry, Joe, and John all pleaded not guilty. Reporters packed into the gallery, eager for every new detail, while outside, the public couldn't get enough of the story. At trial, Barry came off as strangely cocky, at times smirking during testimony, which did him no favors with the jury. Meanwhile, Frank Jr. tried to keep a low profile, attending the trial only when absolutely necessary. He wanted it to be over just as much as everyone else probably wanted it to keep going. Some people felt sympathy for Barry, especially when he claimed the whole plan had come to him during a mental breakdown. He even argued that he believed the kidnapping was a business transaction rather than a violent crime. The defense leaned heavily into Barry's mental health issues, but the jury didn't buy it. He was literally admitting to it, even though he said he was not guilty. Anyway, all 3 men were convicted. Barry was sentenced to life in prison plus 75 years, the maximum sentence. But because the judge ruled he had been legally insane at the time of the crime, he ended up serving 4.5 years. Joe and John also served short sentences and were released after just 3.5 years in prison. Okay. Barry later tried to turn his story into a movie and even pitched a memoir, but none of it ever gained much traction, especially after, here we go, Frank Jr. filed a lawsuit to block the deal because California law prevents felons from profiting from their crimes. Barry fought the lawsuit, saying it violated his First Amendment rights. But after a long legal battle, Frank Jr. won out in the end, and Barry never got his movie rights, which, I guess we can be grateful for small victories. Barry died in November of 2022. At the time of the kidnapping, Frank Sr. was filming Robin and the Seven Hoods with the Rat Pack, and because of the kidnapping and also the death of his close friend JFK, he considered shutting down production, but the film was ultimately completed. Frank Jr. returned to the stage not long after the trial. He continued to pursue his music career, releasing albums like Young Love for Sale in 1965 and That Face in 2006. He also worked as his father's musical director and conductor during the elder Sinatra's later tours. Frank Jr. had a son named Michael in 1987 and was briefly married to Cynthia McMurray from 1998 to 2000. He remained active in the entertainment industry, making appearances on shows like Family Guy and The Sopranos. Frank Jr. passed away from a heart attack on March 16, 2016, while on tour in Daytona Beach, Florida. In some ways, the kidnapping followed or haunted him for the rest of his life. Some people even suggested that it had all been staged for publicity, a theory that drove Frank Jr. crazy and that he denied repeatedly. He never wanted to be famous for the crime, but no matter what he accomplished in music, the headlines always found their way back to that one moment. He joked darkly that he could release 10 albums and win awards, but the first line of his obituary would still be about the kidnapping. Frank Jr. also once said in an interview that the worst part was not the hours he spent blindfolded or the uncertainty, but the way the media never let him move on. Thanks for hanging out with me. This whole story is so sad. Frank Jr. couldn't ever get away from these 3 days in his life, and I guess I'm perpetuating it. I did the podcast about it. And I'm also haunted a little bit, I gotta admit, about Frank Sr. carrying those dimes in his pocket for the rest of his life. Ugh. Anyway, I don't have anything profound to say here. You shouldn't kidnap people. It's not nice, even if you don't plan to hurt them. Next week, we have a case of opposites. Not a jailbreak out, but a jailbreak in? I guess you'll just have to tune in to hear about that one. I'll see you then. And remember, there are always alternatives to kidnapping anyone. Don't do it.